They tried to sell the world a fairy tale, but one empty seat, one missing name, and one woman sitting completely alone blew a hole straight through the illusion. Because this story isn't about love, crowns, or gowns, it's about a family secret so disturbing that silence became the only survival strategy. From the very first second the cameras rolled at Windsor Castle, something felt wrong. The world was told to look at the dress, the veil, the smiles, the promise of modern royalty. But anyone who truly looked saw it immediately. One entire side of the church was empty. Across from centuries of royal bloodlines, titles, and traditions sat one single woman. No sisters, no cousins, no uncles. No grandparents, just Doria, seated alone, framed perfectly for the cameras like an unanswered question no one dared to say out loud. That image wasn't accidental. That image was a decision. Weddings expose families. They always do, especially royal ones. And yet, at the most watched wedding in modern history, an entire bloodline had vanished without explanation. Not late, not off camera, not quietly seated behind pillars. Gone. And that's where this story truly begins. Because when something this public feels this carefully controlled, it means someone is afraid of what might happen if the wrong person opens their mouth. This wasn't chaos. This was containment. And silence, especially strategic silence, always leaves fingerprints. As the applause echoed and headlines screamed progress and unity, one image refused to behave. Doria sat upright, composed, isolated, not embraced by extended family, not surrounded by familiar faces, just alone, under global scrutiny, across from a monarchy that documents bloodlines like sacred scripture. And that raised the first dangerous question: why was it safer for her to be alone? Because by the time the engagement was announced, nothing about this woman's life was private anymore. Royal systems don't miss details. They investigate, catalog, trace, and verify. Family trees aren't suggestions, they're requirements. Which means if something didn't line up, it didn't go unnoticed. And that's where the silence deepened. Instead of transparency, there was distance. Instead of celebration, there was separation. Instead of explanation, there was a quiet collective decision to say nothing and hope no one noticed the gaps. But someone did. Because when journalists began laying out the family genealogy, the kind usually published without drama, they found something unsettling. A blank space, right where a name should have been. Not a typo, not a footnote, not a temporary omission. Across multiple official records, the same absence appeared again and again. A mother without a mother. That isn't a small oversight. That's the most basic biological fact in any family history. And when something that foundational is missing repeatedly, it stops looking accidental and starts looking intentional. People try to rationalize it quietly. Maybe adoption, maybe incomplete records, maybe privacy concerns. But time passed and nothing was corrected. The blank stayed blank, and that blank started whispering a question no institution wanted asked: what happens if that name is written down? Because someone had clearly decided that leaving a hole was safer than telling the full story. For 8 long months after the wedding, nothing changed. No updates, no clarifications, no quiet revisions slipped into databases late at night. Until one day, without announcement, apology, or explanation, a name appeared. Janet Arnold. Just like that. A real woman. A real lifespan. A real past. And once the name surfaced, the doors it unlocked could never be closed again. Birth records. Death records. Burial sites. Census listings, cold, unemotional documents that don't gossip, they confirm. And the timing mattered. This wasn't uncovered years later by chance. It appeared after the vows, after the world accepted the fairy tale, after there was no turning back. Which raises the most unsettling thought of all: if this information existed all along, why did it only surface once it was too late? Because once a name exists, history starts talking. And history did not stay quiet. At first glance, everything looked normal enough. Dates lined up, locations made sense. Parents were listed. Generations extended backward like any ordinary American family tree. Nothing explosive, nothing shocking, until someone did what family trees demand: slow examination. Line by line, branch by branch. And that's when the story stopped being uncomfortable and became dangerous. Because when Janet Arnold's parents were traced independently, a detail emerged that made the records feel unreal. The same woman appeared twice. Same name, same birth year. same death year. Not similar, not approximate, identical. At first, it seemed impossible, the kind of thing you assume must be a clerical error, a duplicated record, a coincidence too strange to be real. Except every document pointed to the same conclusion. There weren't two women, there was one. And that's where the story slows, because once this is said, there is no soft way to say it. According to the fully traced records, Janet Arnold was allegedly born from a relationship between two half-siblings who shared the same mother, a direct bloodline loop, not distant, not theoretical, not symbolic, biological. That blank space suddenly made sense. This wasn't about embarrassment. This wasn't about social discomfort. This was about a truth so explosive that acknowledging it publicly could reshape how an entire lineage was perceived. And that explains the fear. Because secrets like this don't just affect reputations, they affect legacies. By the time the relationship reached royal seriousness, the machinery had already begun turning. Backgrounds examined, files reviewed, risks assessed. And if these records were visible to independent researchers, they were visible to palace systems too, which means the question was never whether it was known. The question was what to do about it. That context redefines everything. The empty seats, the isolation, the careful choreography of who was visible and who was not. It wasn't personal, it was protective, because uncontrolled relatives bring uncontrolled memories, and uncontrolled memories bring truths no press strategy can bury once spoken. In that light, Doria wasn't excluded. She was contained, and the silence around her wasn't neglect, it was strategy. The moment that family tree folded back on itself, the story stopped being about embarrassment and became about risk, because this wasn't a secret that could be laughed off, dismissed, or smoothed over with PR language. This was the kind of truth that powerful institutions fear the most, not because it's scandalous, but because it's permanent. You can't spin bloodlines. You can't rewrite genetics. You can only decide who gets close enough to talk. And suddenly, so many things that once felt off started snapping into place. The distance, the lack of visible relatives, the carefully controlled appearances, the absence of warm, sprawling family moments that usually flood weddings, interviews, documentaries, and celebrations. This wasn't about dislike, it was about containment. Because when a secret has existed for decades, everyone who knows it learns the same rule early: survival depends on silence. At this level, nothing is left to chance. Not seating arrangements, not guest lists, not who speaks, who smiles, who stays quiet, and who never enters the frame at all. Every choice is deliberate, and every omission has a reason. And if you look back now, with this context burned into the story, the wedding doesn't feel romantic anymore. It feels surgical. One side overflowing with history and power, the other reduced to a single, composed figure, visible but isolated. Because one person is easier to manage than many. One person can be coached. One person can be protected. One person can be trusted to keep quiet. Multiple relatives? That's chaos. That's memory. That's risk. And risk was something the system could not afford. The fear didn't stop at optics. According to the same documentation trail that revealed the bloodline loop, deeper concerns would have followed naturally. Conversations that never reach microphones, discussions that happen behind closed doors where no statements are issued and no confirmations are ever given. This wasn't about morality. It wasn't about judgment. It was about legacy. Medical realities don't care about fairy tales. When family trees fold inward, genetic risks increase. That's not gossip, that's science. And when legacy families consider future generations, these conversations happen quietly, carefully, and with brutal seriousness. Imagine sitting in a private room, documents laid out on a table, learning something about the woman you love that even she may struggle to articulate. Imagine realizing that a secret older than both of you could follow any future children, not socially, but biologically. That knowledge changes everything. It explains urgency. It explains why silence wasn't optional. It explains why the safest plan wasn't honesty, but invisibility. Once the marriage happened, the only viable strategy left was to say nothing and hope time would bury what history had already written. But time doesn't bury records. It exposes them. Looking back now, the patterns feel impossible to ignore. The limited family appearances, the lack of casual relatives in documentaries and interviews, the absence of warm, unfiltered family storytelling. Even Doria's presence followed a strict rhythm, appearing only when absolutely necessary, then retreating again into privacy. This isn't proof of wrongdoing. This is isn't blame. No one chooses the circumstances of their birth. No one selects their ancestry. The scandal here isn't blood, it's secrecy. Because secrecy reshapes lives. It forces people into isolation they didn't ask for. It turns silence into armor. It transforms love stories into controlled narratives. And that blank space on the family tree, it wasn't empty by accident. It was empty because filling it in would have detonated a truth no one was prepared to manage publicly, until someone did. Once the name appeared, everything else followed. The records didn't scream. They didn't speculate. They simply existed, calm, factual, indifferent to discomfort. Dates don't gossip. Names don't exaggerate. Connections don't soften themselves to protect reputations. And once those connections were visible, the silence surrounding them became louder than any headline ever could. This reframes everything that came after. The tension, the fractures, the sense that something heavy was always sitting just beneath the surface, never spoken, never acknowledged, but always present. Because when powerful people choose silence over truth, that silence becomes a character in the story. It dictates behavior. It shapes decisions. It determines who is allowed proximity and who must remain distant. The fairy tale wasn't fake, but it was incomplete. And incomplete stories always unravel. History doesn't destroy families like this. Cover-ups do. Because once a secret surfaces, the effort to hide it becomes more damaging than the truth itself. What began as a missing name turned into a missing explanation. What started as an empty seat became a symbol of something far heavier, a past that refused to stay buried no matter how carefully it was managed. And that is the story that walked into royal life, not just love, not just ambition, but the weight of a silence everyone worked very hard to preserve. Because in the end, the loudest thing at that wedding wasn't the music, the vows, or the applause. It was the quiet. And quiet like that is never empty. That is never empty. That is never empty. That